Welcome, you're on the Fringe Show. I'm your host, Tatiana Zalan, and I go live on Fridays at 2 p.m. Dubai time. Happy New Year. It's my first show for this year, and the usual greetings, usual wishes for prosperity and wealth and health and all the best in the new year. The Fringe is about our future, technology, arts, and society. I help you to navigate the rapidly changing world and uncertain futures so that you too can take advantage of the opportunities in the new world. It's episode 64. The very first for the new year, and it's customary to make predictions and forecasts in these types of circumstances. But what I find that many of these predictions that I've read through as I myself was trying to figure out what's happening is kind of more guesses than anything else. I decided to take a little bit of a different slant today through the lens of history and drawing on the work of historians, particularly in big history and cliodynamics. The usual disclaimer before we go further, the views here are my own and they do not represent the official views of organizations and employers I'm associated with. The Fringe Show is for educational and informational purposes only. So what is the big picture here? The problem that I see with short-term and sometimes even with long-term forecasts and predictions right now is their inability to see this broader picture. It's not just about technology or economy or financial systems or financial crisis, but really more about what's going on with our society and even with our human civilization, if you will. We here in the Western world, at least, live in unprecedented times of transformation and transition to a new post-capitalist society. And this is coupled with the transition to a new techno-economic paradigm, which is commonly referred to as NBIC, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive sciences. Plus, it's also a new world order that's emerging, shifting locus of economic power and multipolarity. So what we see is a very rare confluence of trends in events. Most or nearly all of the predictions just assume that we're going through the same boom and bust cycles we used to in the last 500 years of capitalism. They argue that, about what exactly we're facing, how to call it. Is it hyperinflation or stagnation, recession, stagflation, technological singularity, etc., etc. But I think that what we're dealing with is something a lot more fundamental, more monumental, if you will, when the old system is dying and parts of it are dead already. But the ones that are new have not emerged yet. It's like the Twilight Zone. And to survive and thrive in the system, we need to understand at least three things. The system that is collapsing. My show is not about it today. Maybe one day I could do something about it. The major players and their games within the system. I will talk about that a little bit today. We're referring to the elites that rule the world. And trends and tendencies. An individual can be fooled by facts, as one historian says, but if she understands the tendencies and trends, then it's a lot harder to do so. History doesn't repeat itself, as we know, but it rhymes. So a good question to ask is, what does it rhyme with? Have we seen it before? Well, not precisely me and you, but yes, we have, as humanity, been through this period of history that is very much similar to what we're going through now. And that's what the historians call long 16th century, a time roughly between 1453 and 1648. Well, what's special about these dates? 1453 was the fall of the Byzantine Empire and the end of the 100 Years' War. It was a series of armed conflicts between the royal dynasties of England and France. And by the way, the states, as we know them, nation states, did not exist back then. 1648 is the year of the Peace of Westphalia in Germany. It ended a 30 Years' War. The war started as a revolt in Bohemia against Habsburgs, but became a web of different conflicts concerning the constitution of the Holy Roman Empire, religion, and the state system of Europe roughly speaking. It's precisely during these 195 years that we saw a transition from feudalism to a totally new early capitalistic system in Europe. So that was the genesis of an entirely new socioeconomic and political system, which was born out of a crisis and ended with a crisis. The genesis of every new system, again, that's what historians are telling us, is associated with an adaptation to such crisis, primitivization and simplification of institutions, such as education systems and civil society, population decline due to wars, plague, and famine, stronger social controls over the population, and impoverishment of the masses. In our times, that would be us, the middle class. And that's the period we live in now. Not exactly a bright picture, but it's not my purpose to make anyone here feel good or happy or optimistic or sad and depressed about the prospects. This is what it is. And this is where the tools of cliodynamics and big history help us to understand, firstly, the world we're living in, but also what's ahead of us. And this is based, again, on science. Cliodynamics is a science related to history, and it looks at regularities and patterns in several key variables, such as population size, the ages and wages of the population, the size and wealth of the elites, and the economic and the political strength of the state. It's not an approach that uses analogy with past events, but instead it treats historical records just as, say, evolutionary biologists treat their paleontological records. It uses a standard scientific method that works so well in physics, biology, and many social sciences. Theories are first constructed based on general principles, and then they're tested empirically with comprehensive databases. One of the most popular historians is Professor Peter Turchin. He's a US professor, and he's particularly interested in studying theory of revolutions and wars and conditions that lead, generally speaking, to conflict. We're living through one conflict today, right? So one, it's important to understand what he's saying. One is the falling or stagnating living standards of the general population. So that's one condition. But contrary to the widely held view, popular discontent by itself is not a sufficient cause for civil war or conflict or a revolution. What is a more important factor, and that will come up several times during this show, is what he calls elite overproduction. That's the appearance of too many elite candidates vying for limited supply of power positions within the government and the economy. He's written a very interesting book, which I suggest everybody maybe should at least have a glance at. It's called War and Peace and War. And that's really the cycle that we're living in maybe now. According to him, elite overproduction results in intense intra-elite competition, polarization, and conflict that ultimately takes violent forms. And back maybe 10 or 15 years, Peter Turchin made a very strong case for elite overproduction in the US, one of the leading economies in the current world, certainly a leader in the capitalist system. So in the last 3 or 4 decades, he says, real wages of unskilled workers stagnated, but the incomes of the top 1%, on the other hand, grew, leading to an ever-increasing economic inequality. You may ask, well, what are the signs of elite overproduction? What are the indicators and the metrics? That's the growing demand for educational credentials. Tuition rates at elite college, they rise astronomically, much faster than inflation, and the exploding numbers of new MBAs and JDs. In 2008, Turchin published an article in Nature, one of the leading journals, where he particularly focused on an interesting aspect of these wars and conflicts and wars and peaces and wars. That's the relationship between population growth and instability. And that's what historians call secular cycles. And he and his team studied 8 such cycles in medieval and modern England, France, the Roman Empire, and Russia. And what they found is actually quite interesting, maybe even counterintuitive at the beginning. Instability, they said, is always high when the population is decreasing. And the probability of this happening by chance is very small, because they looked at historical data of 8 dynasties in China, for example, or in Egypt of very long period of time. This connection between population dynamics and instability is not direct, it's indirect. It depends on social structures. And one effect is the increasing number of aspirants for elite positions, and that results in rivalry and factionalism. And another consequence is persistent inflation, which causes a decline in real revenues and a developing fiscal crisis of the state. And as these trends intensify, they result in state bankruptcy, loss of military control, conflict amongst elite factions, and a combination of elite mobilized and popular upstrings, leading to the breakdown of central authority. Can these be considered accurate forecasts? No, they are not forecasts. They're rather, we can't predict with those with accuracy when exactly this or that will happen, but they just explain the underlying structure of the phenomena. And plus, there are phenomena such as free will of the population, and that may go anyway. Another scholar that made a significant contribution, in my view, to understanding what's going on and what the predictions will be on what we can expect in the 2020s is David Baker. David Baker is professor of big history at Macquarie University in Australia and futurist as well. Big history is a transdisciplinary area of science, and in big history, people look at 13.8 billion years since our planet Earth started to exist. So it's a really, really big data that looking at. He's also an author of a recent book on big history. And what I want to draw your attention to, and we'll probably post a link in the notes to this article in particular, is the article that he published in early January 2020. Remember this date, it was way before all the events that we saw that unfolded later on with the pandemic and the conflicts and so on. And he called it History Repeats Itself, and that's bad news for the 2020s. And he made some very bold big picture predictions. Stagnant real wages, faltering standard of living for the lower and middle classes, worsening wealth inequality, more riots and uprisings, ongoing political polarization, more elites competing for limited positions of power, and elites co-opting radical movements. It's very consistent with what Peter Turchin, of course, is saying. There's also, he said, a low to moderate chance of a trigger event, shock like an environmental crisis, plague, or economic meltdown, and that will kick off a period of extreme violence. And as he says, these are not just guesses. These are predictions made with the tools of cliodynamics, which uses dozens of case studies of civilizations over the past 5,000 years to look for mathematical patterns in human history. And I would like to kind of focus on this article a little bit, because what he's saying is probably helps us to understand what's really going on. He does spend some time on booms and busts and explaining how this happens historically. As he says, some things that we see today bad signs for these booms and busts, like shrinking real wages, growing gap between the richest and the poorest, raising number of wealthy and influential people who are becoming more competitive and factionalized. Then there is a second important factor, another bad sign, and that's if previous generations witnessed periods of growth and plenty. And this means that your society is just about to hit a wall, and that unless a great deal of innovation and good policy happens. Excuse me. And this is before. This is exactly what we saw before 2020. The global system has experienced a period of growth unprecedented in human history, and that was since 1945. Nearly, the Americas certainly, Australia and Europe, they experienced such great acceleration, as economists would put it. Yet now, in country after country, we see stagnant wages, rising inequality, and so on. So historically, periods of strain and elite overpopulation are followed by crisis, he says, environmental or economic, which in turn is followed by years of socio-political instability and violence. If a country or a system is that of growth and expansion, then all these dynastic, political, and religious animosities would be less pronounced, as there is more of resources to go by, right? But in the period of decline, this can spark a real conflict. And he also talks a little bit about trigger events, what these events could look like, and gives some historical examples as well. He says that, again, early January 2020, we can expect this decline to continue steadily in the next decade, unless a trigger event kicks off a crisis and a long period, perhaps decades, of extreme violence. And here's one dramatic example from the past. In the 12th century, Europe's population was growing and living standards were rising. But then the late of 13th century ushered in a period of strain. Then the great famine of the early 14th century came in. That set off a period of increasing violence. Then came an even bigger disaster, the Black Death of the mid-14th century. After these two crises, and two trigger events, rather, elites fighting over the wreckage led to a certain century of slaughter across Europe. And then he makes a very chilling prediction. I don't know how you would take it, but again, it's all based on the tools of cliodynamics and big history. This is what he says. From my own studies, these depression phases kill an average of 20% of the population. On a global scale today, that would mean 1.6 to 1.7 people dead. So he concludes this by saying that's why humanity's task in the 2020s and much of the 21st century is simply to survive it. Of course, he needs to add his article on a more kind of optimistic note, and he says that probably technology is going to reverse the cycle. That's the only thing that can do that, perhaps a major technological breakthrough, because innovation in the past as well always temporarily warded off decline. And as an example, in the mid-11th century Europe, for example, new land clearing and agricultural methods allowed a dramatic increase in production, which led to relative prosperity and stability in the 12th century. So, historians say, just by way of conclusions, historians say that an exit from an old system, the one that we live in today in the West, that's the terminal stage of the systemic crisis of capitalism, mirrors an entry into a new system. This means that there might be at least 3 decades of rocky sailing ahead of us. So brace up and buckle up. And some of my future videos will be dedicated to this topic so that we can make the sailing a lot easier and maybe even enjoyable. And I also hope for scientific and technological breakthrough. Right now, there is a lot of hype about AI, but in my view, it won't solve any of the biggest issues for humanity right now. And that's the energy issue. That's the biggest issue. Scientists around the globe are now working on the solutions across the globe. It's not just in the US, many other countries as well. So there is hope. And will leave you on this note. It's always useful to remember that there are two layers, two big layers in human history. One is indeed all about wars and conflicts and plagues and death and violence and oppression and so on. But there is another layer, which we don't really talk about that much, at least cliodynamics doesn't, and big history as well, but maybe they do mention it in passing. The second layer is, well, visual arts, immortal music and architecture, it's dance, literature, science, and generally human creativity. If I mention the name Renaissance, what does it associate with? Yeah, you will typically probably think of era of beauty, enlightenment, humanism, nostalgia for classical antiquity. But what if I tell you, but this period actually was a period of extreme violence. We have this romantic idea about the Renaissance, but in fact, it wasn't. And this violence was because of the emergence of a new institution of power in Europe, what Machiavelli called lo Stato, or the state. But I do hope and I think that human creativity will flourish regardless, or maybe because of these very difficult times ahead of us. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion. I would like to see what you think about all these ideas that I talked about today. And again, thank you so much. And I will hopefully see you next week at 2 p.m. Dubai time. Bye-bye.